I'm delighted to introduce Florian. Dr. Florian Knoll received his master's and PhD degrees in electrical engineering in 2006 and 2011 from Graz University of Technology in Graz, Austria. He's currently an assistant professor at the Center of Biomedical Imaging at New York University School of Medicine. And his research interests include iterative image reconstruction, including parallel MR imaging, compressed sensing, and machine learning. And for today's presentation, Florian will be talking about some of their recent works about creating public data sets for MR image reconstruction, organizing global competitions, and some of the lessons learned from that. So we're delighted that you could join us, Florian, and we look forward to listening more.
Thanks a lot, Akshay, for the kind introduction. It's really great to be here. I was asked to give a Journal Club presentation of the recent paper about the fastMRI challenge, and this was really a collaborative effort that we did at NYU together with Facebook AI Research. And before I go into the specifics of the challenge and some of the lessons that we learned and we found very interesting come out of it, I just want to give you a little bit of background information about the project because I wasn't sure how homogeneous or heterogeneous the audience is. So it is about learned image reconstruction for accelerated MR imaging. And in general, what I mean with this is, for the rest of this presentation, we take our case-based data from the scanner, we put it through a neural network, and this gives us our images. So this is pretty much the setup that I will be talking for the next 30 minutes or so. And in particular, what I'm going to focus is reconstructions from accelerated acquisitions. And you all know this, I don't need to go into any detail or background. If we are scanning half of the case space or a quarter of the case space and just do a trivial reconstruction, then we end up with images that have aliasing artifacts, and we can use iterative reconstructions, compressed sensing, parallel imaging, whatever we have at our disposal to try to recover the cleanest images. And one of the tools that emerged to solve this task a while ago was machine learning, and in particular, the model that I'm going to describe here, which was what we ultimately tested was in the challenges. You take your accelerated case-based raw data, you put it through some kind of neural network that you have designed. This gives you an intermediate reconstruction. You have a fully sampled ground truth available that you can use for training, and you use some kind of similarity measure to compare between the ground truth and the reconstruction. And you minimize this reconstruction error during the training by adjusting the parameters in your network. And in a formal way, you just minimize this cost function here. So this is written out for just L2 as your error norm. You loop over all the examples in your training data set, and this gives you your trained model. This was started, I would say, about 4 years ago at ISMRM. We saw the first presentations that went into this direction. Here are just a couple of our early examples from our first paper that we wrote on this, where we, on this slide, you can see a comparison of parallel imaging, combined parallel imaging, compressed sensing, and the machine learning approach. And what excited us from the beginning on these results was that we saw a very nice suppression of aliasing artifacts combined with good SNR and a good depiction of high frequency texture information, no over blurring. And then we continued working on this. This is just one of our recent clinical examples. So we are currently in our study testing this prospectively. So we are scanning patients. We have scanned a little bit over 100 patients now, where we do back-to-back first the clinical standard sequence, which is roughly a 12-minute protocol, and then an accelerated 5-minute protocol, which we send through our machine learning reconstruction. And so far what we are seeing is that the images are pretty much interchangeable from a diagnostic point of view. So you can see the pathology just fine based on the feedback I got from the clinical partners in the project so far. This is another example from Stanford. Joseph Cheng sent me this for abdominal imaging, and they did a very nice study comparing compressed sensing with a deep learning approach, and essentially found the same for abdominal imaging, that in comparison to compressed sensing, you get very nice depiction of fine details without compromising SNR or residual aliasing artifacts. So these results were great. The AIMI community or research community really jumped on this. There are tons of papers coming out every day. But there are also several challenges associated with this. And I just want to highlight a couple. So this paper came out I think earlier this year, and the archive paper was up for about a year before that. And what they did in this paper was that they used adversarial attacks on image reconstruction and found that they can perturb the reconstructed images with modifications that actually look pretty benign on the input images, but they completely break the reconstruction. And this is obviously not surprising. This is an ill-posed inverse problem, and it has a huge null space, and you can exploit this if you just design it in the correct way. And they did test a couple of reconstruction approaches, the AutoMap approach from MGH, ours, and CT reconstruction approach from Lausanne, from Michael Unser's group, and found pretty much comparable results. So in comparison, the compressed sensing reconstruction was very robust, and they were really able to break them in machine learning reconstruction. And they raised the question of, okay, how stable are these methods? Is this an issue when you transfer this into clinical practice? And then another question that we always found interesting is if you use very, very complex models. So this is, for example, training again as a prior. And if I ask you here, maybe somebody wants to take a guess, some of these images are real scans, others are completely synthetic. Does somebody want to try a guess which the real MR images are? I have shown this to resident candidates, by the way, and I have almost seen a 50-50 answer. So if you use the images very much, you can spot that the bottom row looks a little bit funky. So they are synthetic. Sometimes the algorithm places particular anatomical structures in different positions. But overall, yeah, even trained medical students, radiology, residency candidates have a hard time distinguishing between those. And what that tells you is that these models have the computational power to really synthesize images that look completely realistic. And they can come up with pathology and can come up with anatomical details that are really hard to spot if they are artificial. And that is, of course, an issue if you use such a prior in a reconstruction where you don't want to create a synthetic knee. What you want to see is what have you measured in this particular patient. And if you have the ground truth available to compare, then it is very easy. You can just see, okay, are my features real or not? So this is one of our results with such a prior. But if you don't have the ground truth, then it's really hard, and you can really ask the question as a clinician, to what degree can I trust these images? And one thing that has really always bothered me a lot in this field as it was growing was when the first papers came out, and I'm not pointing any fingers at anybody, I'm including ourselves here. So this was our paper, and we tested this on 10 patients. And then there's another paper that did 1 healthy volunteer. Then 27 patients, that was actually your paper from Stanford, so you are the outlier here, congratulations. Paper from Imperial, 7 subjects, tested on 3 subjects, you get the idea. And what I found really problematic here is that in contrast to the computer vision community, where they have very established benchmark data sets, and it's very clear when you read a paper and they report an error metric on ImageNet or on a Kaggle competition, then everybody can put this in context with other work and they can reproduce it and compare their own work against it. In these preliminary or first papers that came out, it's really impossible for me as a reader to compare method A with method B because both were trained on different data sets. For the most part, the data wasn't made public. And then I really know nothing about the algorithm. Is this algorithm performing better because they had better data that is not shared? Or is it really better because it is superior method? And that was bothering me for a very long time, and that actually sparked was the motivation to start this data sharing initiative and then ultimately the challenge. So let me talk about this now for the rest of the talk. This idea came out of our collaboration with Facebook AI research, and the idea was really, at NYU, we were collecting all this data and we were de-identifying it with very careful, sophisticated procedures, and it was a fairly large data set, and we did all this so that we could share this data with Facebook. And then the question really came up with, okay, if we are putting in all this work, then we should really share all of this with the general public so that everybody can profit from it. And in particular, what we did in terms of data curation was first, for the knee example, we put together a data set of close to 1,400 cases with of full case-based raw data. And then earlier this year, we followed this up with a second data release of neuro data, over 7,000 cases, a variety of scanners, variety of contrasts. So all of this is available for free. You can get it at the webpage. Link is displayed down there. You don't need to write any research proposals or anything. You can just click on the user agreement and go ahead and use it. And for the knee data, which was the data that we then used for the challenge, just to give you a little bit some specs about this data. It came from 4 different Siemens magnets, most of them 3T, some of them 1.5T. All of them had 15 channel coils, and the range of the sequence parameters, it was 2 sequences. We only had coronal acquisitions, one with fat suppression, the other one without fat suppression. And we try to keep the sequence parameters as uniform as possible. But of course, there is a certain range because these are clinical protocols. And depending on the particular system, the location where they were scanned, they were slightly different. But it's not a bad data set in the sense that it's completely heterogeneous. So you can do fairly reasonable machine learning training. What we did then, and this is the first table from the paper that I'm sharing here, is we split this up into a training, a validation, a test, and a challenge set. So what do I mean with this? The training and validation sets, we provided everybody full case-based data and a corresponding ground truth reconstructions. And you can see the corresponding number of cases and slices here. For the test set, this we made public from day 1 too, but we only provided undersampled data, and participants could upload this to our webpage, and we had a public leaderboard there while everybody was developing their algorithms. And then we kept a certain number of cases back, which we called the challenge data set. and those were only available for a time period of roughly 2 weeks, and during that time people could submit to the challenge, and they would be the official challenge participants. We had a couple of different tracks here, and in particular, the reason why I chose this type of track submission was because I wanted to have test a couple of scenarios. So the first track that we called multi-coil 4X, this was really defined or designed to be representative of what I believe is really feasible in clinical practice with this data. To what degree can we push the acceleration so that you get clinical image quality? In comparison to our clinical protocol at NYU, that is twice as fast, and that is exactly what we are doing in the clinical study that we are doing at the moment, the prospective study. So the goal here is to have a 5-minute knee protocol as opposed to one that's just a little bit over 10 minutes. And this we chose to be full multi-coil parallel imaging data, exactly what you would get from a state-of-the-art scanner. The second track, the idea behind this was push the models to a point where they will most likely break. And the reason I did this was because I really wanted to see how the models react if you actually don't give them enough data anymore. I did not expect any submission to give me like clinically diagnostic images there. It was really to see how do the things react when you push them beyond the point where they should actually work, because you just give them too little data. And the last track, that was the single coil track, that was removing the parallel imaging component, just providing data as if they would be acquired with a body coil or a single receive challenge. And the motivation behind this track was really to get the community outside our conventional or usual suspects MR image reconstruction community involved. I'm talking about the data science people, classic computer science people, because there is a bit of a learning curve, understanding how the multi-channel reconstruction works, how to deal with this data. And because we specifically wanted to engage the broader research community, show some of the computer science, data science people that MR image reconstruction is an interesting project, and channel their attention into this direction, we made this track. It's, from a clinical point of view, I don't think it's particularly relevant, but as you can see, we actually got most of the submissions for this track, and I think that just tells you that it has a less learning curve, and yeah, people can just start working on this a little bit faster. So let me talk about the pipeline that we used for the challenge. So we had our challenge data that we provided for this 2-week window, together with the undersampling masks, so 4 times accelerated, 8 times accelerated. And we asked the participants to send us their reconstructions. We compared those to the fully sampled ground truth reference that we held back. We populated a leaderboard, and we provided metrics, root mean square error, structural similarity, and PSNR. And then we created a ranking. And in particular, for each of those tracks, we chose structural similarity to be the deciding metric. And then we took the top 4 submissions from each of these tracks, and those we sent to a panel of 7 radiologists throughout the country. So it's not only people at NYU. And we asked them to grade these images and determine the winner. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the grading later, but first let's look at the results of the structural similarity. And this gets us into the lessons learned or the actual results of the challenge. And what you see here is a plot of all the submissions that we had for the 3 tracks. And the one thing that already gets obvious here is that at least the top submission, there is next to no difference in terms of structural similarity. So it was actually really, really hard to distinguish between these submissions based on this metric. So we still chose it. We chose the top 4. It's a little bit unfortunate, maybe for the 5th or 6th person, because there's not a lot of difference there. But that's, yeah, that was our deciding cutoff. The other thing that is obvious really is the difference that you see between the multi-channel and the single-channel tracks. And that, I think, is a really strong argument how much you actually gain by using the multi-channel information. Because so many times, I mean, the single-channel track is easier to get into. You can start working on it right away. But you're really throwing away a lot of the information if you don't use the multi-channel information and do a proper parallel imaging, compressed sensing type reconstruction. And yeah, this is how the leaderboard looked like for the 4 times multi-channel track. And let me show you a couple of images that I selected for the paper. So these are the top 4 results for the multi-channel 4 times accelerated track. On the left, here you see the ground truth. So this is an example, just randomly selected, not particularly curated, for the non-fat suppressed contrast and the fat suppressed contrast. And here are the submissions ranked by the final radiology scoring. So the winner here of this track came from Philips and Leiden University, tied with a submission from Johns Hopkins and United Imaging. And what you see on the far right here, this I did after the challenge was concluded when I was writing the paper for it. This is a parallel imaging, compressed sensing reference reconstruction. And this I did with my own total generalized variation parallel imaging method that I really know inside out. So I can tune this as good as anybody, I would say. And what I also did was, for the paper, I optimized all of the hyperparameters, everything in the optimization, looking at the ground truth. So I did an inverse crime, creating this comparison. None of the participants had seen the ground truth. I knew the ground truth. I tried to get as good as possible. And I find it just really, really striking by what degree all of the submissions outperform my attempts to get the best possible thing, even though I'm technically cheating. And it's both in terms of objective and subjective image quality, looking at the images, and also in terms of structural similarity. So you can see that the results, so this is structural similarity just for this one particular slice that I'm showing here. They are pretty close together between the individual submissions and the compressed sensing reconstruction, or my attempt really falls short here. And it's the same for both contrasts. This is just showing you different images of the reconstructions to the ground truth. And what these essentially tell you is that there is not really a systematic loss of particular image features that you can say, yeah, you lose the pathology because you haven't trained for it or something like this. It is just pretty much everything. You lose subtle, high frequency information. You see that a lot of the noise is filtered out. Most of these reconstructions have a better perceived signal to noise ratio than the ground truth, actually. That's just the inherent denoising capabilities of all these neural networks. And again, the compressed sensing parallel imaging reconstruction is just in general worse. It doesn't preserve more structure or anything. One thing that is interesting is, and that is a lesson that we learned after the challenge was concluded, after we got all our radiologists' report, and we really then looked into it very carefully and looked for pathology. Because one thing that is important to note here for the radiologist's evaluation, we did not show the radiologists the ground truth. We only showed them the individual reconstructions of the participants and asked them to rank them and give some scores. So it was not an evaluation where they had the ground truth available and then we could see, okay, how close do you think that this come to the ground truth? They did not know what they were missing. And this is a case of, you have a really, really subtle pathology here, this little lesion. And you can see that it is actually not particularly well visible in any of the machine learning reconstructions that we got. But I have to point out that it's also completely lost in the parallel imaging compressed sensing reference. So that is not trying to say, oh yeah, the machine learning reconstructions didn't work. It was just, I would say, no longer visible at this level of acceleration. The 8 times accelerated results, you can see that they pretty much tell the same story. I would say it is actually very, very impressive what type of image quality, again, we got from the participants. The difference to the parallel imaging compressed sensing reconstructions even more obvious here. I mean, these are completely useless images, whereas the, at least for the non-fat suppressed one, they look pretty decent considering that this is not a lot of case space actually to work with. What is a little bit tricky here is that here let me first talk about a positive thing, because one of the questions that generally come up with machine learning for image reconstruction is what happens if you have a gross abnormality, if you have pathology, or something that is really unexpected. So in this particular case, we had a huge metal artifact from just a nail, so huge susceptibility, grossly. I'm sorry about that happens when you sit in the medical center. There's lots of ambulance cars going by. So this is really a gross abnormality. It is completely unphysiologic, and you can see that none of the reconstructions from the trained methods is in any way irritated or disturbed by this or filters out this abnormality. So it's really, really well depicted. One of the challenging things is this case here, this fat suppressed case here, has a meniscal tear. So it's this little high signal intensity part here. And you can see that, or you cannot see it anymore in any of the accelerated reconstructions. Again, not blaming the machine learning reconstructions that they missed the pathology, but this highlights an effect that I think is potentially worrying, and that is that these methods give you images that can look really, really well. So the pathology is gone. There was simply not enough data measured. And you can see from the compressed sensing reconstruction that it's essentially useless. But the difference is, on the compressed sensing reconstruction here, you can immediately spot that this is a useless image. No radiologist would ever look at this and base a diagnosis on it. These images actually look pretty reasonable. And it may be challenging, or that's probably a new learning experience again, and it was the same as for parallel imaging and for nonlinear reconstructions as for compressed sensing, that people, or with people I mean clinical radiologists, get comfortable, they understand the failure modes, they trust these images and know when they will fail. I think this is a huge topic going forward. Just showing you the difference images here again, they essentially tell you the same story. So no particular systematic removal of particular features in the machine learning results, just in general loss of fine detail and high resolution information. And the single coil results essentially tell you the same story. So again, huge outperformance by the participants to the compressed sensing. Oh, it's actually a typo here. This is obviously not parallel imaging compressed sensing. This is just compressed sensing, single coil. And again, you see the same thing in the difference images for the single coil results. One thing that I find particularly interesting, and I actually have to thank one of the reviewers of the paper for this, who suggested that I include this, is because this question came up, for example, with the perturbation adversarial attack study from the PNAS paper. Okay, machine learning methods can work really well, they give you nice results, but are there situations where they just fail dramatically and fail in an unpredictable way, where the image actually looks fine, but the machine learning model just gives you complete nonsense? So what I did here was I looked through our entire challenge data set and looked which cases were the worst in terms of structural similarity. So where are the machine learning reconstructions at their worst? And what would have been worrying in my point of view, if it were images, for example, of a pediatric case versus an adult, or something with a pathology that you didn't see, that if those throw the machine learning model off and they suddenly don't work at all, that would really have been a sign for instability, in my opinion. But what you can see, what happens is that literally it was the images with the lowest signal to noise in general. And interestingly, every single submission performed worst on the same case. So it's not that I just took one that was worst for the winner. I literally, for every single submission, looked at where did they perform the worst, and they all performed worse at the same case. And also, I again did the comparison to parallel imaging and compressed sensing. And what you can see is that even in the situation where the machine learning models are at their worst, they still dramatically outperform parallel imaging and compressed sensing. So I think this is a little bit of confirmation when it comes to the fear of, is machine learning reconstruction unstable? Will it not work in practice for certain outlier cases? At least the results that we saw from the study did not confirm this. They consistently outperformed compressed sensing, and there were not some selective outlier cases where we just completely, or the participants just completely failed. Yeah, just again, showing you the difference images that illustrate that in general, you don't lose any specific anatomical or pathological features. I want to talk a little bit about how we did the radiologist scoring, because I thought that might be interesting for people. And essentially what we asked them was, take the top 4 submissions and rank them from 1 to 4. Which one do you like best? Which one do you like least? And we didn't give them a large amount of instruction what they should base this on. So in the end, it came down to subjective or personal preference of the radiologists, I would say. One thing that I want to point out is that we also asked them, in addition, rate them on a scale from 1 to 4 in terms of some categories: artifacts, sharpness, contrast to noise, and diagnostic confidence. And we didn't specifically tell them, choose your winner based on the best scores you give here. You can rank them whatever way you want. But it turned out that for most of the tracks and most of the radiologists, they actually just took their scores that they gave here, summed them up, and gave or ranked their, or chose their preferred ranking based on these scores that they gave here. I think in 1 or in 2 out of the 3 tracks, all 7 radiologists did it like this. In 1 track, 5 out of 7 did it like this. This may not be exactly true, but the exact details are in the paper. So with these information, so the radiologist scoring and the quantitative results, we did a little bit of a meta-analysis of comparing our evaluations. And one thing we tried to plot was to see, is there a correlation between the quantitative scores and what the radiologists like? Because it's a very common critique of image metrics like structural similarity, PSNR, that it actually doesn't depict what is important for a radiologist when looking at an image. And this plot, I wouldn't overinterpret it. The problem is our N is really, really low. We have 7 readers who scored them. So please take this plot with a grain of salt. But what we found was that for the multi-coil 8X track, there was actually a perfect correlation between structural similarity and all of the 3 metrics actually, and the radiologist's score. And this was a track where the predominant issue was loss of resolution. So here, the things were perfectly aligned. The multi-coil R=4 track, what this really tells you is that the top 4 results were so close together that the radiologists couldn't really objectively distinguish between them. It came down to personal preference. And I illustrate that, or you can see that even better on the next plot that I'm going to show you. And for the single coil data, where the predominant issue was lack of SNR and noise amplification, what you can see is a positive correlation of structural similarity with the radiologist's finding, and the negative correlations of the others. So does that mean that the quantitative metrics are useless, or does it mean that they are great? I wouldn't be so bold as to make any of these claims because the N is pretty small. But I was actually positively surprised, like I said, for the multi-coil 8X, how well the alignment between quantitative metrics and radiologist scores were. And just showing you what I meant earlier for the multi-coil 4X track. So this plot shows you the individual preferences of the 7 radiologists. And one thing that you can see, for example, what ended up being the last place of the finalists, actually 3 out of the 7 radiologists ranked this submission as number 1. 4 others ranked it at number 4. So it's really, some people prefer slightly sharper images. Some people are really don't like it if there is noise amplifications. So by all means, I think for the multi-coil 4X track, the top 4 submissions, you can see them as being almost identical, even in the radiologist's rating. For the other tracks, there was a pretty clear winner. So the winning entry, both all the radiologists either ranked them as number 1 or as number 2. So those were pretty clear. And in a way, this is not surprising, I think, because the multi-coil 4X track is one that I specifically designed because I expected those to be clinically usable results. And you can see that the state of the art of the research community can solve this problem at this acceleration rate for this field strength and this number of coils. I think we are there that we produce clinically usable images. For the other ones, it's obviously more challenging. So this is all I almost had for the previous challenge. What I want to point out is that the next challenge is going to open on October 1st. It's going to be on neuro data. And this time we have a special, what we call transfer track, to address some of these issues that in the previous challenge, we only had one scanner type in there, or a very narrow type of scanners. So the transfer track will be to test robustness of methods if they were trained on one set of scanners and then applied on different set of scanners. So if you're interested in that, then this track may be of interest for you. And again, challenge opens up on October 1st. Submissions can then be submitted until October 15th. So if we would get 1 or more submissions from Stanford, we will of course be very happy. And just to discuss what in my opinion, major lessons learned and some of the restrictions of the last challenge was obviously all the data came from NYU. It was just all from Siemens scanners. The protocol range was pretty narrow. So in terms of robustness to outliers, the results were pretty robust, but we really haven't pushed this in this challenge. It was pretty benign in terms of domain transfers and stuff like that. Our radiologist evaluation was subjective. There is no doubt about it. And we did not ask the radiologists to really make a diagnosis and compare that to a ground truth diagnosis. That is something that, please keep that in mind when it comes to clinical usability of all of this. It was on a subjective level. One thing that I found actually interesting, or you can see this encouraging or not, depending on who you mean, but one of the things that people always seem to be afraid of with machine learning reconstructions is that they hallucinate features. That you suddenly have pathology or a ligament there that is artificial. So we did not see this at all in any submission. What we did see was loss of high resolution features, and in a way that it's very, very comparable to what you get with comparable compressed sensing or parallel imaging, combined parallel imaging, compressed sensing. So from that point of view, all the models actually behaved very, very benign and very understandable, I would say. Doesn't have, but I would like to point out that all of our finalist models actually were very, very similar. So nobody submitted again. That would have been interesting, getting completely photorealistic images that have nothing to do with the ground truth. It would have been challenging for our radiologists' evaluation too. And all our models, our finalist models, used supervised training and all used an approach that somehow combines a data fidelity term and the learned regularizer, something that you can see as an evolution of compressed sensing and not some radically new black box, purely data-driven AI approach. I would like to point out, though, that we certainly, with the design, how we organized the challenge, we gave people ground truth to train. So if you would have used an unsupervised training model, you would just have made your life harder. So I think the type of data that we provided really shaped what type of submissions we got. At least that's my interpretation. So I just want to show you the timeline again of the challenge that's running. And yeah, I hope this was enjoyable for you and we can have a good discussion.